Republican State Representative Nate Schatzline of Fort Worth. Thank you so much and welcome back to Eye on Politics.
Oh, Jack, it's always an honor to be on, honor to get to talk to you about everything going on in Texas.
Well, lots going on with regards to the Department of Education. As you know, President Trump last week had an executive order to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. First, your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's an amazing thing. Look, this is all about returning education back to our state. The Federal Department of Education is actually relatively new. Most people don't even know that the cabinet level position was created by Jimmy Carter in 1979. And in 1980, President Ronald Reagan actually campaigned off the idea of eliminating this because we believe in local control. And so sending this back to the states just gives our local ISDs more power. I believe it's going to provide more funding for our students, and it's going to take away from this radical federal leftist ideology we saw from the Biden administration that is coming down into our local school districts here in Texas.
Why do you think it's going to end up providing more revenue for schools in Texas?
Well, here's the deal. We know that Donald Trump was super clear, President Trump, which is so good to say. But he said that he vowed not to stop funding for critical programs such as those for students and for educators. I think it was Secretary of Education Linda McMahon that said, "Today's reduction in force reflects the Department of Education's commitment to efficiency, accountability, and ensuring that resources are directed where they matter most to students, parents, and teachers." And so I think what we're going to see is a little bit of a removal of all these special projects and definitely a removal of any of the federal overreach into the way our local districts should be ran. And we're going to see a lot of those tax dollars sent back to the states for us to be able to send them to our local ISDs the way that we want to send them.
As you know, Democrats are pushing back. There was a news conference at the state capitol and the state house this morning. Democratic Congressman Greg Casar was among those who are critical of the president. And this is what he said. He said, President Trump and Elon Musk talk about efficiency, but there is nothing efficient about making our public schools poorer. There is nothing efficient about failing to give a great education to the next generation. Your response?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, in total spending, we are third in the nation in the state of Texas. I hear all the time that we don't fund our public schools enough. And I hear you when it comes to recapture. We have to look at that. I've got a bill that's going to work on that, making sure that the money stays in our districts from our tax dollars. But that being said, in total spending, like I said, we're number 3, meaning that we spend around $16,000 per student. Look, this is a great plug for us to fight for education freedom, for school choice, to be able to send our students to the school that we would like to send them. Because hear me, many of our public ISDs are being incredibly inefficient in the way that they're spending their funding. Look, I believe that we've got to crack down on this right now. And I believe as we begin to send from the state, eliminating the Department of Education at the federal level, we're going to see a lot more local control, a lot more ISDs receiving money from the state, being honest about where that money is going. And I really believe that we're not at risk of defunding public education. Like I said, we are spending the money on students. I believe there's going to be an increase in the basic allotment, as well as record teacher salary increases this session in the state of Texas. And so, look, this is just Democrats being Democrats, having a talking point. They're angry that the president, his rankings are going up. People like him. People like what he's doing. This was a campaign promise. The American people knew what they were voting for when they voted for Donald Trump, and that is the end of this federal overreach and returning the power back to the states and local communities.
One other thing that Congressman Casar said was that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are stealing from America's children in order to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. How do you respond to that?
It's just simply not true. Eliminating, government overreach, eliminate government spending is returning money back to the taxpayer. Look, here in Texas, we need to be putting Texans on a path to eliminate property taxes. My advice for the congressman and for all Democrats in Texas is to focus on how we make life better for Texans right now. That's the elimination of property taxes. That's giving them universal school choice so that the money follows the student. I am not worried about funding systems. I'm worried about funding educating students and making sure that they have the resources that they need. And that's why President Trump said that he's not going to stop funding for critical programs that students and educators use. Look, this is just another scare tactic. This is them working towards 2028 when Governor Gavin Newsom runs for president. They're working towards an agenda right now. And the reality is President Trump is winning. This is a massive win for the American people. We are restoring local control once again. And like I said, I believe that there's going to be an increase in funding for the things that matter and a decrease in funding for the things that don't.
And what protections, because some of the things that I've heard from Democrats are that they don't have the faith in the state of Texas to fully protect marginalized students and other student groups. And so what do you say to that?
Right. Well, I would ask them first, what is a marginalized student in their definition? Because right now I'm working on a bill that bans the social transitioning of minors. You know, it's hard for me to take those statements seriously from a Democrat when many of them, if not all of them, voted last session against protecting our daughters from biological men competing in women's sports, when many of them voted against the ban on gender mutilation surgery for minors. So when I look at students that are marginalized or students that need extra resources, oftentimes that's conflated with these social warrior issues from the left saying that we have to sexualize our kids. Here's what I'm focused on. I'm focused on getting back to education and getting away from political and sexual indoctrination inside of our public schools, including the teaching of hating America and hating our great state and hating the values that made our nation so great. And so for me, my focus is simple. Let's get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know, 23.2% of students in Texas are considered college ready. That's not near enough. And only 43.2% of students who are graduating in Texas are proficient in math and reading. We can talk about marginalization all day long, but in my view, this is a waste of time. Let's get back to educating kids. Let's get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and let's get back to making Texas the #1 state in education freedom and the #1 state in educational outcomes.
And let me ask you one other question on education based on what you said. And that was, you said Texas is #3 in spending. And I know that a number of critics for the way Texas spends money on public education, and I've talked to them and they've said that Texas is 44th or 46th in the US when you look at it per capita. And that, you know, Texas would still have to spend quite a bit more, as like double what the House has proposed in spending, which is $9 billion, about $9 billion in new money. And so I'm wondering, how do you respond to that? Because the numbers really are all over the place and people don't know who or what to believe when it comes to how much money is spent on, you know, per student on public education.
You're absolutely right. The numbers are all over the place. And the reason that they are is we have people like Tasby, who's using our taxpayer dollars to go and lobby against us in the state capitol. I can't tell you how many Tasby people are walking through the halls, even today, lobbying against the taxpayer. And that's one of the reasons we must end taxpayer-funded lobbying in the state of Texas so that our tax dollars aren't going towards lobbying against our interests as the taxpayer. But that said, the real reason that we're hearing these numbers, like we're almost last in school funding, is because they're simply isolating the basic allotment. We have to look at total spending and total school funding. Again, that puts us at #3 in the nation. We can isolate numbers all day long to get to the agenda that certain people want us to get to. But the reality is we have to be honest with the numbers. And we're spending upwards of $16,000 per student, even though the basic allotment is $6,100. So while we're going to have an increase and while we're going to have an increase, record increase in teacher salary increases, what we're talking about is almost $100 billion that's going to be allocated from the Texas budget to public education. And so I think it falls on deaf ears when you're talking to a taxpayer who's getting taxed out of their home, a veteran who's being taxed out of their home, a mom or dad in a failed ISD system that, hear me on this, we've got Carroll ISD, Keller ISD that are getting hit with recapture and they're making the best with what they have. Meanwhile, we have Fort Worth ISD university that is getting all this funding, and yet they are failing students day in and day out. Houston ISD, failing students day in and day out. And so we have to focus on what matters most, and that is empowering parents, making sure we continue to fund public education. However, being honest about the true numbers of what we're spending in the state of Texas inside of the Texas budget.
And what are some of your other legislative priorities?
Yeah, so HB 1071, I've been working it for 2 sessions. This is the Adoption Assistance Program. Look, I truly believe this. If woke corporations can send their employees out of state to have for people to get abortions for free, then adoption ought to be a free in the United States of America nationwide, and we can start that right here in the state of Texas. So this
And
would essentially
how would
create a
that work?
grant program. Yeah, it would create a grant program that would allow adoption to be free. And the other one that I think is so incredibly important, and that is my bill to ban socially transitioning of minors in the state of Texas. Again, that's HB 3616. And so this is vitally important. We banned gender mutilation last session. This session, we have to go after this evil agenda to socially transition our students.
So how is it different than what passed the last time?
Yeah,
So
so
that
last
wasn't
session,
all inclusive?
no, it wasn't. And so it's a great question. So last session, we banned gender mutilation surgeries as well as hormone blockers. But what we see right now is that we have counselors and even some educators that are going against the will of the parents. And they're socially transitioning these students into believing that they can be more than one gender. Well, we know that there's only male and female. And if we don't start talking in reality rather than perpetuating mental illness, we are going to end up with a generation that is completely lost. And so it's time to bring common sense back to the classroom, back to education, and bring parents back into the conversation.
And what do you say to members of the LGBTQ community who feel as if they're being targeted by members of the Texas legislature?
I'd say that's silly. Look, at the end of the day, adults can do whatever they would like to do. But what we're trying to stop is the perpetuation, like I said, of mental illness and allowing irreparable damage to be done to the next generation that starts with a conversation that's behind closed doors, away from parental consent. Listen, we believe in parental rights here in Texas. So we're going to fight for parental rights on every step of the way. Moms and dads need to be in these conversations, and we need to make sure that we're telling the truth and fighting for the truth inside the state of Texas.
State Representative Nate Schatzline of Fort Worth, thank you so much. We appreciate
Thanks
it.
so much. Appreciate it, Jack.